Well, it's time now for Focus, and we head to Egypt, where the regime's crackdown on dissent is growing. Doctors, lawyers, and now journalists are all targets of the government, and a police raid earlier this month on the press union triggered the latest outcry. The causes are much deeper than that. Egypt is one of the worst countries in the world for press freedom violations. Our team in Cairo sent this report.
An unprecedented standoff between journalists and the regime. Chanting journalism isn't a crime, these press syndicate members are vowing to stand up for their rights. The crisis erupted on the 1st of May, when police forces raided the syndicate and arrested 2 journalists sheltering inside.
By breaking into the syndicate, the police violated the dignity of the journalists. They broke into a bastion of freedom that's always stood by the Egyptian people by unveiling the corruption of this regime.
The regime has crossed a red line in the eyes of many journalists. They've started a sit-in, demanding the release of their colleagues who are under investigation for inciting anti-regime protests. But according to Khalid al-Balshi, a union member, that's just a pretext for forcing the syndicate into line. Freedom of expression in Egypt is in a dire state, reports say. 29 journalists are currently behind bars.
It's not only about the prison terms given to journalists. It's also about the violations of freedom of expression, pressure, censorship, articles that are being removed and changed in the printing house. There are physical attacks against journalists. We have counted 782 violations within the past year.
But the movement is losing momentum. The syndicate wants the interior minister to be fired and an apology from President al-Sisi. Not all media outlets want to go that far. Some accuse the syndicate of fueling the crisis. This MP, editor of a pro-regime newspaper, accuses the union of being close to the Muslim Brotherhood and denies that press freedom is under attack.
I can prove that all the people in jail have been imprisoned because they're either members of the Muslim Brotherhood or perhaps terrorists arrested with arms who are plotting against the security forces. But there's no journalists who have been arrested because of their job. There's no freedom of expression issue.
The crisis follows a growing offensive against the freedom of expression. In 2013, when the military took over from the Muslim Brotherhood, the press overwhelmingly backed the new president and called for a united front against so-called terrorism. But opponents and critics have gradually been silenced. Author Ala al-Aswani, who was active in the 2011 revolution, is now persona non grata for Egyptian media. He had to stop his political columns, collected in a book called Democracy is the Solution.
Democracy is the solution is the sentence that I was using at the end of each of my articles. This book is a compilation of the columns I wrote between the Egyptian Revolution until 2014. Since then, I've been forbidden from publishing articles in Egypt.
Even though he initially supported the army's intervention, his subsequent opposition to President al-Sisi prompted every Egyptian outlet to ban him.
The owners of newspapers are businessmen who are afraid of the regime. Authorities see me as someone who is against the regime, which is true. I'm against dictatorship. And they also perceive people like me as troublemakers.
Social media is the last somewhat free space in Egypt. But it's also a target. No criticism of the regime is permitted, even in the form of satire. The Street Children, a group of young comedians, were arrested last week because of a YouTube video mocking the president.
This video does not defame anyone. So why are they being charged with inciting protests, publishing videos that insult national institutions? What does the sarcasm of a group of young people have to do with such serious charges?
Cultural life as a whole is now under threat. Townhouse Gallery, a unique space in the Egyptian cultural landscape, was temporarily closed in December. Then a demolition order was given after part of one of its old buildings collapsed. For the gallery, a rallying point for young activists after the revolution, it was a clear warning that the tide had turned.
New spaces opened up in the city downtown. It was much easier. There was a greater degree of freedom. Now we have to realize there are forces much greater than ourselves that we can't compete with. And we have to look at what we can do tomorrow to have the impact that we had yesterday.
The few spaces left for free expression are increasingly controlled. Not only journalists, but also artists are having to adapt to this new environment.
For more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by Alexandra El-Khazen, head of Reporters Without Bureau's Middle East Bureau. Thank you for joining me here in the studio. Firstly, I'd like to ask you, we saw in that report, of course, the crackdown is much wider than just on journalists. It's also on artists as well. But in terms of journalists, what have we seen in arrests recently?
So just to point out the way we see the situation in Egypt, we consider Egypt today to be one of the biggest prisons for journalists after China, Eritrea, and in Iran. So we have like at least 25 journalists that are behind bars. They are accused of criminal charges. So officially it's not charges related to journalism, as officials always defend themselves, saying that, denying that any journalist is behind bar because of his work as a journalist. So the situation is really critical, and with what we've seen with the last weeks with the different protests after the story of the crisis around the couple of inhabited islands, so there have been massive arrests of journalists and even protesters in general. We had like at least 30 journalists behind bars. Arrested while they were there attempting to cover the protests. They were arrested with their equipment, even though they showed the press card saying that, identifying them as journalists. So of course most of them were released a few hours later. But this is indicative of the whole climate.
Well, then how then are authorities justifying their actions in terms of the arrests?
The
and jailings as well.
So they justify it by considering journalists like protesters as criminals, harming the country's reputation, harming property, assaulting officers belonging to illegal organization like Muslim Brotherhood, doing some kind of this violent activity. So this is the way they present it. In fact, but we have had like many cases of journalists who were just arrested, as I said, with their camera and put behind bars. We have had the case, for instance, of this photojournalist who is very known, called Mahmoud Abu Zaid, known by the name of Shokan. He was arrested on August 2013 while he was covering the protest, the pro-Morsi protest, so the dispersal of the protest. He was arrested with foreign journalists, two others who were released like 2 hours after being arrested while he is still in prison. He waited 2 years before seeing any judge and without any charges. So this is how to show you a glimpse of the situation for the journalists in Egypt today. Yeah.
We saw in that report, however, that the journalist union is not necessarily completely unified. Why is this?
It's difficult because one thing that has to be pointed out is that since the raid on the syndicate, so we have had like journalists who usually support the regime, support the government, who have criticized this move, even like with the whole series of public opinion crisis, we have had like a kind of solidarity within among the journalists after what happened with the syndicate. But yeah, there's of course this division with, as we saw just lately, that some journalists accuse them of being a pro-Islamist with the Muslim Brotherhood. So the society and the media has always been polarized in Egypt. But more and more today, we hear more like people on TV was unprecedented, or in the media criticizing the regime, demanding more answer related to the economy, the state of the security, etc., etc.
You mentioned that media has always been polarized in Egypt. Now, social media and the internet is one way, of course, a lasting form of opposition. But is that also helping and leading to the fragmentation that we're seeing?
Of course, social media, traditional media, of course, I mean, they all reflect the state of the society actually currently in Egypt. The thing is, like we always considered in the whole world that social media is a way for journalists and ordinary citizens to express themselves, and it's more freedom on the social media than in other places. And in fact, in Egypt, actually, there's a cybercrime law that is being studied in the parliament. So, and if this law will pass, we will see like the whole space of freedom on the net will be considerably reduced. So we'll have like really harsh sanctions like life imprisonment, death penalty for crimes on the net. Like they accuse any crime of harming national security. So that they're not really defining what is a crime against national security, and this is why it's very annoying and very dangerous for the citizens.
What is the situation then for foreign journalists working in Egypt?
It's a bit more different because they have the support, I guess, of the international community. Unfortunately, reacts more quickly for foreign journalists than for local journalists. They have the chance to have this international support. So they face the same restriction on the ground when they want to cover, for instance, a protest or something like that. But whenever a foreign journalist is arrested, he will benefit from a wider support than local journalists, unfortunately.
All right, Alexandra El-Khazen, thank you for coming in and joining with us your perspective on this.
Thank you.
All right, well, we are going to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more live from Paris. We'll have the latest from Venezuela, which is braced for more unrest today. This says protests are planned nationwide. Now, there's mounting public outrage over President Nicolas Maduro's sweeping emergency measures. You see that's the latest on our website there at France24.com. Do stay with us.